We've got a lot of great goals. We've got some posted up over here as well. Let's go ahead and get started. I want to thank all of you for being with us today and all of you online as well. We do have several great speakers with us today. So let's go ahead and we're going to start by introductions. And we're going to go alphabetically. So Emily, you get to go first. Please introduce yourself. Share a little bit about your social media experience and platforms that you use, and what your preferences are in terms of social media or how you use it.
Sure. So I'm Emily Lakdawalla. I'm Senior Editor and Planetary Evangelist for the Planetary Society. I've been on Twitter for a very, very, very long time. I was suggested to go there by Phil Plait of Bad Astronomy, who was like, you know, those really short blogs that you're writing to do launch updates, you really ought to do those on Twitter. Twitter would be a better medium for that. So I've been on Twitter since shortly after, probably, it's been 10 years, I think. Has it been around that long? It's been around for a while. I know. Anyway, so that's the primary social media platform that I use. I do have like Facebook pages and stuff, but I have had on my to-do list for about 2 years to delete my Facebook, and one of these days I'll get around to that. I don't really use Instagram or anything like that very much. It's really just Twitter.
Thank you. Awesome. And next, Ed, I think, is it? I'm trying to remember. Let's see here. Yes. Okay. I am wrong. It is not Ed next. And I've got too many windows opened here. Okay. Dr. Alex Parker, are you with us? And if so, can you please share a little bit?
I'm here. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Great. So yeah, as it says, I'm a senior research scientist at the Southwest Research Institute in Boulder. I'm primarily a Twitter user. I have dipped my toe into various other platforms and have tried to keep at least build ideas of how I might deploy onto those platforms in the future, but at this point have stuck largely to Twitter. And prior to joining Twitter, like Emily, I've been using Twitter since like 2009. I have also developed a large suite of visualizations and sonifications over the years. So my initial foray into science communication and social media use was actually as just a content creator and not exactly one of a active social media user myself.
Well, thank you. Okay, Ed, now you're next.
Hello, everyone. I'm Edgar Rivera Valentin. I'm a staff scientist here at the Lunar and Planetary Institute. You can follow me on Twitter at @PlanetTrekkie because I trek the planets. No, I'm here. Yeah. Let's see here. I haven't been on Twitter for a very long time, since 2012 or 2013. That is my primary platform. I got into it actually because @PlanetDoctor mentioned Twitter and how she was using it to communicate what she does to people, and I was like, oh, maybe this will be a cool platform. So I've been using it to communicate my personal experience as a scientist, to increase my visibility in terms of as a Latinx scientist and as an LGBT scientist, and also to communicate what I do to people.
Thank you so much, Ed. And Julie, last but not least.
Hi, I'm Julie Tagelski. I'm the communications specialist here at the LPI. So I actually tweet and post on social media channels in an official capacity for the LPI. I've been doing it for about 2 to 3 years, I think. And we actually have a small team of social media contributors. So I'm primarily on Twitter, and I'm starting to dabble more in Instagram, but then we have another group that is more like posting to Facebook and Flickr, Pinterest, and we also do some YouTube. So.
Awesome. And so Julie can be one of the folks who gives us an institutional perspective as well, which is important to have, although everyone has a little bit of insight there as well. We've got professionals here joining us. So let's go ahead and we will move on to the next aspect. What we are going to do now is we are going to invite a few of our speakers are going to share some thoughts that they have that could be of use to everyone. And then after that, most of the time will be spent in question and answer. So we'll invite everyone to ask questions and have a good discussion. But we're going to start off with a few pointers. So Ed is going first with his tips on first-time users.
All right, so my quick spiel about tips for first-time users as someone who, I guess, semi-recently started, though you beat me 2 years. What I would say is, and something I heard at the last time that we had this type of webinar at LPSC is, as a first-time user, it might be easy when you go on Twitter or another platform is to follow people that you know are communicating science, or scientists that are actively doing this, and then maybe just sit there for a week or so or more just watching what they do and how they do it. I know that's how I personally learned. When I started Twitter, I just spent like a good month following people and just seeing the equation, in a sense, in their minds, how they were being able to communicate what they're doing at the level that is accessible to a broader audience on Twitter. And then I think something else that we discussed last time, and something that is important to me is, at least to me as a scientist on social media, is to set up my goals in terms of how I want to communicate with people and present myself as a scientist on Twitter. So I start off by saying, why do I even want to be on here, right? My goal, again, was I want to increase the visibility of having more representatives of Latinx in science and LGBT in science. So I want to make sure that what I'm tweeting, at least primarily, is representing that. And the visibility aspect is important for multiple axes. It's not only important in terms of having other members of those groups being able to find individuals that they can empathize with, but also to ensure that you are breaking stereotypes. Just existing and showing that not all Latinx fit your stereotype, that we can be scientists, that we can do this, is an important aspect of what I am doing. So a lot of times on Twitter, you'll see me just retweet people and say, "Huepa," which is Puerto Rican for how awesome this is. Or another version of it. Yes. And you need to do the spirit fingers. It's very important. Jazz hands. So I'll be doing that. I run an account called Boricua Planeteers, which is a group of planetary scientists from Puerto Rico, and we'll be doing the same from there. So have in your mind a good goal and good objectives that you can try to frame your presence on social media. If your point to be on social media is to communicate your science and communicate yourself as a scientist. A couple of little points I have found a lot of the times. So I've also run the Arecibo Radar account, the Arecibo Observatory account, and a bunch of other more institutional accounts. And what I've found is that people will like and retweet or / interact more with tweets that have pictures. So it's kind of easy for asteroid stuff because we can put out a delayed Doppler image, which looks like a pretty picture of an asteroid, and people will more easily interact with that. So I've tried to hone in making those type of pictures prettier. So consider when you're tweeting about your work, if you can try to attach an image to it, it might be easier for people to interact with it and to understand it. And the last thing I will say is, after you considered your goals, after you've considered your objectives, you really should consider what is your audience and what you want, who you want to be talking to. So one person mentioned in their goals communicating in Spanish, right? So I do bilingual tweeting, and what I try, generally I am tweeting in English, but when I'm about to tweet something that I know, okay, this is going to be specifically geared towards people in PR, towards people in South America, for primarily people that are speaking Spanish, and I will go back down to Spanish. I will go to Spanish and I will start tweeting there. If it's something that I'm trying to tweet about the work I do and it's for a conference, sometimes I will be tweeting in English and in Spanish, and that's really, really a migraine because your brain goes switching between languages is so much fun. But I will do that, or I will try to, at the beginning of a conference, at the end of a conference, switch to just one language. But I won't be doing that all the time. It is when I know that my audience is going to be requiring this need. So it's about the need of your audience that you're communicating with. So just some things to consider.
All right, thanks, Ed. And now, Alex, you had some thoughts that you wanted to share as well that we think would be pretty valuable.
All right. So a few of the things I'm going to mention, basically just reiterate what Ed has already stated, and I was going to open with talking about what is your why. And it's really important to consider why you are using a given platform or why you feel like communication is important. I saw a really excellent presentation a few years back from a sociologist studying science communicators. And they did a broad survey across a number of different disciplines, so science communicators in different disciplines, asking essentially, what is their why? Why do they think science communication is important? And I was sort of surprised by this presentation because the conclusion that they came back with, averaged across all fields, was that people do science communication primarily to correct misconceptions. That is the motivator of science communicators. And that really didn't resonate with me. That didn't seem like a thing that I had experienced in my interactions with other science communicators. And I went up to speak with the speaker afterward. And he turned to me and he was smiling. And I asked him why, and he nodded behind me. And every astronomer and planetary scientist that had been in that room was lined up behind me to ask him questions. And every other kind of scientist that was there, this was it was a National Academies talk, so there were scientists from every discipline, had left for the coffee break. And so he said, I said across every discipline, but I was just simplifying. It's true for every discipline except astronomy and the planetary sciences. In those disciplines, their primary reason for doing science communication is to inspire awe. That is the modal reason for acting on social media. And that doesn't have to be your why, but it's just that, recognizing that we exist in a special domain among the sciences, broadly speaking, is important and valuable, just to have that as a context. So for me, one of my other primary motivators is building trust. So when I'm operating on social media, I want to act as a humanizing figure, someone that when people are thinking about scientists, they don't think about an abstract concept of a person in a laboratory wearing a lab coat that is just an automata producing context-free facts, right? We are motivated by human goals in doing our science, and we are stymied by human frustrations in achieving an understanding of what it is that we want to understand. And all of those are really important in building trust and an understanding of what science is and how science is done. And we live in an era where scientists are trying to communicate basic existential threats to humanity, and absent a powerful trust as to the motivations of why scientists are studying the things they're studying and where that science is going and where it's coming from, we end up in a very bad place. So a powerful part of building trust in this is just being a visible human being. So being more than just a font of facts and correcting misconceptions, but being a person and sharing how you interact with what it is that you do in a way that is relatable is really important. And I'm going to talk about basically two ideas there, two ways that you can do that. And the first one is the idea of relatable frustration. So this is, it's something that I fall back on all the time because I just find it very effective, and maybe it's my shtick, but it's really easy to connect with people over simple frustrations that we run into in our research lives that actually are common across many different areas and walks of life. So recently I shared a tweet. I didn't think it would go anywhere. I hadn't really thought it through as a tactical tweet, but we were trying to get a new dye laser up and running in our lab downstairs. And this is a very expensive piece of equipment that most people have never even heard of what a dye laser is or why you would operate one. And we couldn't run it that day because it required a keyboard with a PS2 port. And we just didn't have one kicking around, which was weird. You'd think there was some closet somewhere that would have one of those. But I just shared a photograph of this extremely powerful laser that can blast holes in things at 100 meters range. And we can't turn it on today because we don't have this piece of 1990s technology handy. And this particular piece of relatable frustration that everyone has run into this exact thing before, of being like, oh man, I don't have that thing that I know it's in a drawer somewhere, turned out to be a really great hook. That tweet took off and ended up being retweeted by Neil Gaiman and garnering like enormous views, why would Neil Gaiman care about a lab laser? I can't think of any good reason. And it's not that. It's just that there was this relatable moment embedded in that brought a bunch of people into thinking about, well, why would someone care about having a gigantic dye laser in their lab? What kind of science would you do with that? And they would have had no reason to emotionally connect that before, but we opened the door with that little bit of relatable frustration. And the second thing I wanted to bring up was the idea of just emotional resonance. It kind of builds on that. And it's thinking more broadly about what is it about the thing that you're doing that will resonate emotionally with people. And there's a lot of shorthand and a lot of, I think, actually short selling of the power of this in the way that some popular media writing is done, where you kind of look for a lowest common denominator sort of approach, but that doesn't need to be the case. An enormous amount of what we do, at least in my experience, is driven by an actual emotional drives. We're not in this without context. We're doing what we're doing because we care about it. And stepping back and thinking about why we care about these things, and not telling other people why they should care, but just sharing it from the perspective of why you care, what it is that resonates with you. That resonance will speak to other people more so than you telling them you should care about this because it will impact your bottom line, or it will, or using shame or other tools to try to motivate people to care about what it is that you're doing. So I'd be happy to go into that in greater detail in the Q&A, but I just want to wrap up and say that overall, this is why I think that being a humanizing influence on social media is really important as scientists.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alex. All right, Emily, you're up.
All right. So first, I just wanted to respond to a couple of things that Ed and Alex said. I 100% agree that the big value of participating in social media is to humanize your science, not just yourself, but also to show yourself in relation to the rest of the scientific community, and the dynamic that's there, and how science these days is not single people working by themselves in labs. It's a community of people working together, and a community of diverse people. And since I now have a pretty big Twitter following, I like to use that to amplify the voices of people who don't look like traditional scientists, and try to help raise the profile of people who can serve as models for other people out there who may not be sure if they fit into this enterprise. So we are all humans, and humans make mistakes, and sometimes we can goof up in small and big ways in social media. So I thought I'd share a couple of insights on how to deal with that. Once in a while, we may say something, use words or something that we didn't realize offended a group, but it turns out that they do, for instance. So here's one example. And so the question is, what do you do with that? How do you respond? I'm actually a big fan of deleting tweets. I think that it's better to delete a bad tweet than to leave it out there. But don't just delete it and run away. If you have maybe unwittingly used a slur of some kind that you didn't realize was a slur, then you need to write, you can write a fairly generic and kind of elliptical tweet, one that says, I tweeted something earlier today that I regret I caused offense. I'm sorry. I took it down. I've learned today. Something like that. You can Google how to do effective apologies that admit responsibility and that avoid the kind of non-apologies like I'm sorry people were offended. It's very important to avoid that kind of behavior. If you get in a beef with somebody else personally who is in your community, it's good to take that private, and then you don't have that kind of stuff happening out in the open. Sometimes something that you say can get screen capped so that deleting the tweet doesn't help you. And in that case, you do have to have a more direct response to the content of the tweet. Avoid stating your intent, because intent is not result. Again, Google for how to make an effective apology, and focus on the steps in those suggestions about taking responsibility and making sure that you demonstrate actual remorse and an intent not to repeat whatever the mistake it was that you made. This has happened to me a few times. I've tweeted things. I probably should have more rules about not tweeting late in the evening after a couple of glasses of wine, which you might want to set your own ground rules that limit your behavior to make sure that you won't do something that you regret. You also ought to have, if you become active on social media, you ought to have a frank conversation with your human resource department or your supervisor about what boundaries your job has on your tweeting. I'm very fortunate in that my employer views my Twitter account as my private business. It's not an official account. And so we have some ground rules about how, I'm not supposed to criticize my organization in certain ways. I have to be careful as an employee of a nonprofit organization not to advocate one candidate, political candidate over another, to talk about causes and not candidates. So those are the kinds of things, pitfalls that I have to avoid when I'm tweeting. But just, have those conversations, make sure that things are out in the open between you and your employer or your supervisor so that you know what you're stepping in. And you can step in things deliberately if that's your choice, or avoid pitfalls if you want to avoid them. Also, be safe. If you're new to social media, be careful about including information that can reveal, like, for instance, where you live, where your kids go to school. Be considerate of others' privacy, so don't take photos of people, say at conferences, without their consent. And share them. It's extremely important to ask for permission to take a photo and then ask for permission again if you want to post the photo on social media. And usually people are happy to. If they're at a conference, they're expecting to be seen by other people, but you always have to ask for that kind of consent. Trying to think of what I jotted down some kind of random notes as Ed and Alex were talking. Be especially careful to protect your kids' privacy, because one thing that I learned recently was that it's become a rite of passage in middle school to Google your name and find out if you have any results coming up for your name on the web. And it's seen as some kids find it kind of shameful or will embarrass other kids if their name shows up. My daughter did that and asked me to take down a couple of posts that I had where there were some photos identified with her name. And I did that and I scrubbed the Google results. And now I'm very careful to never mention my kids by name, even though I do talk about being a mom quite frequently. I try to be careful about their privacy, and I do occasionally tweet a photo, but I ask their consent too. I talk with them about consent and make sure that they're okay with how they're being represented out there. One more piece of advice before we go on into the Q&A. Kind of decide ahead of time what your MPAA rating is, so you don't surprise people afterward. I kind of feel like I have a PG rating. I try to keep it mostly G, but once in a while I'll get a little salty. But apart from that, I try to keep it mostly so that people would let their kids read my Twitter feed. You may do something completely different, and that's totally okay. There's nothing wrong with it. Just be consistent and don't surprise people. There's no right or wrong about how often you tweet. There's lots of advice out there about, if you want to maximize your audience, tweet like this or that. But if you're not necessarily out there to get the most followers, if you're out there to effectively communicate science, just do it in a way that's comfortable and natural for yourself. And you'll get a following of people who want to follow you for who you are. And that's cool.
Awesome. Wonderful. And all three of you have said some of the things that I'm going to just share, but I'm going to put these up in slides. Instead of reading them to everyone, I will let you all read them to yourself. And while you are doing that, I'd like you to start thinking about what questions you have for all of our speakers. And that includes Julie as well. We didn't have her share right now, but yes, think about what sorts of questions you might have for the speakers. And while you're doing that, I'm going to add a couple of additional tips here. Many of these things have already been said. So guidelines, following others first, follow a variety of people first. One thing that wasn't said, you might want to start up with setting a two-factor authentication to keep your particular social media safe, so that others don't crack it and do things with it. So some of these things have been said already. And I also wanted to share some ideas about content. It did some very interesting thing with my bullets. I apologize for the for the random pattern of bullets that didn't look like that when I looked at it on my computer. So while I'm letting you read these, again, please think about what questions you might have. For those of you online, feel free to start posting questions online now in the chat box, or if you would like in a second or two, you can unmute yourself to ask a question. Those of you here present don't have to do any of that. You can just ask them. So, and the hashtag, yes, there is a hashtag that you can use, hashtag LPI social, and a couple of folks in here are monitoring the hashtag, so please feel free to enter questions in the hashtag as well, hashtag LPI social. So let's give ourselves 30 seconds of wait time. Does anyone have a question? And so far, we have a very quiet group. We've got about 15 people total. Surely some of you have questions. Maybe 16. I think a couple people just joined. Yes, Patrick is going to turn on a question here.
So you just mentioned the two-factor authentication. I don't have a Twitter myself, but I share the Arecibo Radar Twitter. Can you keep something secure if several people are using it? Or do we just have to hope our password is pretty good? And
Yeah, we have that problem at the Planetary Society where there's only one cell phone number for the two-factor authentication. So there's one keeper of the two-factor authentication. You either remain logged in, or if you're logged out or need to log in on another device, you have to coordinate with the keeper of the two-factor device.
One thing that we've recently done for one item that we use that isn't social media is we had, instead of it being a telephone number, we had it be an email address that goes to the 3 people. So all 3 of us get the request for the two-factor authentication and can enter the code as needed if it's an email that's shared. Any other comments about two-factor authentication among groups? We've got a couple of new questions that have appeared in the chat box. So Sherelle, why don't you go ahead and read the chat to everybody? Let me give you the microphone. So let's start with Tracy's.
Okay. We'll see her.
Oh, Tracy.
Oh, I see it. Okay.
Oh, so I see a question about, Tracy says, I really like the information about what to do if you tweet something that gets a negative response. Are there topics that I explicitly avoid? Definitely, there are topics that I avoid. A good example is Elon Musk. I do not mention him because all of a sudden there will be Elon bros in my mentions hassling me about saying something negative that I typically didn't even say. An example of this is when he launched the convertible in the first Falcon Heavy launch, and I posted a clarifying tweet that said, this is a pretty amazing accomplishment, but I want to point out that the car is not going to Mars. It is going to Mars's distance from the sun, but Mars will not be there, and that's a good thing. And people were like, why are you hating on Elon? And I was like, okay, I'm done with that. So there are topics that I avoid just because I don't want to deal with the responses. And recently, in order to be able to have the sense of community that I feel on Twitter talking about things that don't get those kinds of responses, I created a Slack workspace of just a small group of supportive women who we hang out together in Slack, and then there we can post whatever, and it's a very safe space. So I save a lot of topics for that space.
Awesome.
I also, one of the things that when I'm confronting these things, I tend to like to step back and do some introspection about whether or not I think my voice is actually helpful. And that can be really, it's really ambiguous. And you have to that know oneself be true. But in a lot of situations, I find that either amplifying someone else can be really useful, or just staying out of it. I don't necessarily think that my perspective is always going to be the thing that crystallizes everyone's understanding. So why muddy the waters? Related to that, though, one thing, if you develop a significant following, you have to be careful of is recognizing that that amplifying someone else's voice isn't always neutral for the person that you're amplifying, and particularly if they're stating a opinion that will be controversial to some large fraction of your followers. So, for example, Emily has the attention of a bunch of people that are really defensive of Elon Musk, and so if she amplifies someone that says something tangentially related to Elon Musk, all those followers of Emily's can pile onto this person that might only know how to deal with 100 or 200 followers on their own. And this can be totally overwhelming. So thinking about your following and the way that people among your following interact with people that you amplify is really important. And this is, I think, is probably pretty important for anybody that's doing work with institutional platforms. If you're representing an institution, that those will often have larger followings than perhaps your personal account. And choosing to amplify individual employees or volunteers or things like that, you should think about the way that what content of theirs that you're amplifying, how that will interact, how your followers will interact with them.
Yeah, and to add to that, sometimes somebody may be talking about, for instance, a negative experience in academia. That's a common thing that's talked about on Twitter. People discuss their negative experiences. And I may have pause about retweeting some of those things. And so the simplest thing to do is just to send a direct message to the original tweeter, say, hey, how would you feel if I retweeted this? I don't want to bring any attention that you don't want. And they either say, typically they say yes, but once in a while I've had a no, and that's okay. You just respect that and move on.
So we've got a few other questions online. One that I wanted to respond to is Tracy's first question: what balance do you typically strike for personal versus professional posts? And this is one that I feel like goes up and down for me. Right now, I'm hardly posting any science, and I'm posting a lot about my beehive and my chickens. So this is I think if you come for the fancy visualizations and stick around for my chicken posts, that's great. That's what you're getting with me as a follower. I don't know that I have any particular target. But again, like I said, part of my goal is to build an idea of me as a scientist, as a complete human. So if that's not your goal, if that's not a thing that you want to do, you can stick to being very professional all the time and only ever amplifying things that are science related, and that's totally fine. And then as for feeling like bringing personal posts into it, I think you can think of those either as catharsis or as tools, right? It can be great to air things on social media when you think that there's space for that, or that it's that would be a good thing to do. But you can also do that in a way that's that helps amplify your broader message. So I couldn't give you a 50-50 or some other split of how I try to do that. But I also don't necessarily think I can argue which generally gets more interest. I find that I think my most popular series of tweets in history were about a baby blue jay that we rescued last summer, and that went totally wild. It had nothing to do with my science whatsoever. I posted the first ever color photo of Pluto. That did okay, but man, that blue jay was really something. So I wouldn't have any ability to predict. I think I can't read the tea leaves that well.
Just to quickly add, I guess my answer to that question would go back to, again, something I mentioned at the beginning, which is, what is the goal of your involvement in social media and your use of that tool? For Alex, it was humanizing science. For me, it's increasing the visibility. So it's whenever I go to tweet, if it's something about my personal life, I always stop and say, is this meeting that goal? Am I showing and increasing the visibility of Latinx and LGBT? Is this working for that? If yes, then go ahead. And if I'm talking about science, then it's my science. So it's going back to answering that first question: what is your goal with this tool?
Awesome. We've got a number of other questions. So would any of you like to talk about how we keep the audiences engaged in the research without dumbing it down? Dumbing down the content or the importance?
I want to jump in because that's a phrase that I want to expunge from all of our vocabulary. You need to view what you're doing not as dumbing down your content, but as translating it for people who speak a different language from you. So science, all academic endeavors have their own vocabulary, their own language. And when you're speaking with people outside your subspecialty, you have to just use different language. So when you're talking about your work, you need to translate it into terms that other people will understand. And you also need to provide a lot more context to people so that they understand why what you're doing is important. You know, why are you looking at squiggly lines from very dim objects that are very far away? Why do we care? Well, I want to learn about the surface of this other world. Why? You know, what fundamental questions are you getting down to? And you don't have to answer that with every tweet, but once in a while to step back and to say, and you know, learning this, will hopefully answer these questions in the future, or I want to try to figure this out, or we've been trying to figure this out for decades and we haven't yet, but this is a little tiny step in the direction of figuring out the answer to these questions. Presenting science as a series of questions that we're seeking answers to, as opposed to a list of facts of things that we've already found the answers to, is, I think, really valuable. And saying I don't know a lot is actually really awesome, because I think it's really important to younger people especially to indicate that science is about confronting how little we know and trying to develop the best answers we can given the capabilities that we have.
I will absolutely die on the same hill as Emily when it comes to expunging dumbing down. I've been in some media rooms with some writers that absolutely had terrible opinions of their readers. And I think the products that they produce as far as science communication were far inferior to groups that hold their readers, hold the people listening to them in high esteem and high regard. I think the number one thing that I do every time I try to produce content is to not underestimate my audience, to give them as much benefit of the doubt in terms of their ability to be interested and to comprehend what it is that I do, and to step back and think that I'm not that special, right? I'm focused on this thing, but I'm just another person. And if you operate from that position of respect, I think you can do some really cool things. It can be harder. It's really easy to slip into jargon or communicating like you're communicating with someone else in the field in terms of using a linguistic shorthand that we've all developed and agreed to use within our community, or to think of this as this act of dumbing down and walking the line of instead doing what Emily says of translating it, of thinking that these are a group of people that are capable of comprehending everything that we can comprehend. And it's our job to tell that story in a way that makes it accessible or interesting, or provides the context that's necessary to see why it's interesting. And I think another part of it is trying to avoid making science into something that's like a special, rarefied endeavor. I tend to think of it as an act of storytelling, one of the longest running acts of storytelling that humanity has ever conducted. We've been building upon stories that have been told by people, our scientific ancestors, so to speak, for many, many generations, and that what we're trying to do is take what we can see and turn it into the next chapter of that story. That's what I've done to provide guidance for the way that I communicate, the way that I do science. I don't know that it's necessarily something that will help anybody else communicate their science, but I find that stepping back and thinking about it from that perspective of how do I tell this, how do I communicate what I'm doing as if what I'm doing is telling a story. Sorry, let me mute. I've got a call coming in on another line.
Ed, I used translation as my metaphor here, but I think code switching is another good metaphor. I was wondering if you had anything to say about that. In sort of a science context. Maybe not. I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm sorry.
No, I'm trying to put my words together because I had prepared this other paragraph in my head. No, so in terms of code switching, so I see that in terms of, okay, first, I agree with everyone. I hate that term dumbing things down. I think whenever we use that, we are putting ourselves on a pedestal and forgetting that we are people as well. Whenever, and you're suddenly forgetting that when people think that they have to do that, they're forgetting how to talk to people. And they're just centered on talking to in academia, in that jargon world. But something to consider in all of this, in terms of code switching, all of this, it's cultural in how one communicates and in the type of terminology, jargon, not jargon, que es la palabra, like metaphors one use. Like to this day, I will see metaphors in English that I have no idea what the heck they mean. And I'm like, there's a black mark on something? Is this like Pirates of the Caribbean? I don't understand what's happening. It's weird. So it's things like that. I'm sorry, I'll go into a tangent. But what I will say in terms of all of this, in terms of how I try to communicate my science, Alex mentioned storytelling. If you haven't noticed, I'm ridiculously passionate and over-exaggerate a lot of things. And one of the comments that resonated with me that an audience member told me when I was giving a talk in Puerto Rico is, after my talk, actually in several occasions, the kid came up to me and said, you know, I've thought about science, but when I've listened to shows, when I've seen people, they all look so stuffy that I just didn't want to do this. Your talk, actually, you were funny. I didn't know scientists could be funny. I didn't know scientists could be this way. So doing that and understanding, not thinking about it dumbing down, but thinking about it in terms of broadening your audience and broadening your engagement is the better way of thinking about it. It's also the better way of trying to humanize what you're doing.
Thank you all. We've got a couple questions related to which social media platforms. One was about which social media platform is most popular with astronomy fields, and then there was a follow-up in terms of which are the top 2 or 3 social media platforms that people should use to engage people, especially amateur astronomers and citizen scientists. I will say that the Pew Research came up with a report from just a couple months ago, and in that report they demonstrated across the U.S. and I've got a link to it from a handout that is going to be on the website, on our website, that you can all upload, and I'll email it to everyone shortly. Currently, Facebook and YouTube are the most widely used online platforms among U.S. adults. And Snapchat and Instagram are very popular, especially with young adults. And I didn't say here because they didn't look at teens, but of course that Snapchat and Instagram are hugely popular with teens. AGU has a handout that I've also linked to in my handout about the different platforms and the amount of time, the length, the images, the audience, and the ages that those platforms tend to use. That being said, none of these are specific to astronomy, planetary science. So I will let our speakers respond.
Anecdotally, I know that amateur astronomers congregate on Facebook. They have for a long time. So if that's the audience you want to reach, that's the place to go, unfortunately. I think I think most of the professional scientists who are engaging with each other do it either on Facebook or on Twitter. Instagram is more for like a kind of an outward sharing kind of thing. The engagement, I think, is happening more on Facebook and Twitter.
That's what I was going to say, is that I think if you want to engage with a community that's broad and has a very just broad reach with few barriers, places like Twitter is great. Facebook, you tend to have to find existing groups. So it's not that you just post to Facebook and other people will find it. It's you have to decide to interact with a group that already exists and may or may not be moderated by someone that you agree with. So there's value in both. I'm a member of, just professionally speaking, there's a couple of Facebook groups that I have found to be relatively non-toxic compared to other professional Facebook groups that I've been a member of in the past and am no longer. My favorite of those is Astrostatistics. But as far as doing outreach work, I have never used Facebook in that regard. My work has ended up on Facebook, but through no fault of my own. And as for things like Snapchat and Instagram, they are, they reach different audiences for sure, but they're a different modality of communicating. You can use them in similar ways, but it's more challenging to do so. So I think that just comes down to how it is. If you want to be a content producer and allow people to consume that, that might lead you to one platform over another. If you want to build interactions with people, places like Facebook or Twitter might be easier ways to discover the kinds of people that you want to have those interactions with.
Julie, Ed, do either of you have any thoughts? Julie, which platforms is LPI currently on?
So LPI is currently on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram we're starting to dabble in a little bit.
YouTube.
And yeah, YouTube, Flickr, Pinterest.
Thank you.
There's a good question. How much time do you all actually spend on Twitter? For me, it can be a lot, but I'm trying to do a lot less because I realized that I've been reading Twitter instead of reading actual books, and that's not really good for my education or my mental health. So I'm trying to do it less. But I spend a lot of time on Twitter professionally if I'm covering some kind of big event, like say the Rosetta landing on a comet or something. That's the best place to interact with people and engage with people when there's something exciting going on. And I'll just spend the whole day on it, tweeting about it, answering questions. I might do like an online Q&A for an hour or something like that. And it can be just the most effective way to reach out to a ton of people at once.
I see a question about how do we expunge, based on the earlier conversations, the culture of superiority that might exist within the science community based on the earlier question and discussion.
Man, if someone has an answer for that, I'd like to hear it.
Yeah.
I think it takes constant engagement and conscious effort to recognize it, particularly in ourselves, when we're adopting it without realizing that's what we're doing, when behaviors that we've had for years are impacting other people in ways that they will perceive as a statement or impingement of authority or superiority. But I don't think there's any silver bullet. It just takes a lot of care and conscious effort.
And be a good example.
Yeah. There's one question in here that I've been thinking about. How do I highlight the things that make me unique without focusing on only those parts of my history? And it's an interesting question. And I don't know that I have a fully formed response, but I do have one thought, which is that there are a lot of things about myself, and I'm a cis-ex heterosexual white man. So I don't look at a lot of my history through the lens of like, how can I use that as an example of something that I've gone through, or I don't know. I don't view the lens through which I've experienced my life as particularly novel or new. But there are certain things that I've held in reserve, experiences that I had in the past that I found particularly impactful, or that I thought might be really good teachable moments. But sometimes they're sensitive or not entirely clear cut. They might dabble into some gray area or something. And I tend to think really hard about under what circumstances would I deploy them? What would be both the moment for like chief impact or the moment of minimum harm, if there was risk of harm, to bring these things out, to air them, to share them. And so I think of them as sort of a finite arsenal of these, whatever these experiences are that have been important or formative for me. that I think will be useful for a particular conversation or to tell a particular story. And I treat them like a very precious resource. Certainly not among friends or whatever. I'll tell this story about finding a dinosaur when I was 7 years old to you like 8 different times, I'm sure. But there's only so many times that I can deploy something like that effectively in a social media sense. More broadly, like, how do you highlight the things that make you unique? I think just, share your voice. If you've had unique experiences, but your voice is the same as everybody else's as far as social media is concerned, then are your actions actually unique? So I think just being a voice for yourself, representing who you think you are, and allowing that to speak for itself is probably the most important thing. But again, I'm speaking from a perspective of someone that I don't think I have any particularly unique viewpoint to express. If you're trying to present, one of Ed's goals is to represent Latinx people as scientists, and he might think very differently about experiences that he's had in the past when trying to share a given story on social media. So I can't speak for him or other people that have had very different life experiences.
So in terms of sharing my past on social media, when I have done it in terms of giving some of my stories from the past is to, it's as a empathizing tool. It is to show someone that they're not alone when someone is suffering. Like Emily, I think, mentioned that sometimes people in academia a lot will be tweeting how horrible graduate school has been for them, or how something in the past has affected how they're acting today. I do it to show that they're not alone. As an important aspect of humanizing science and humanizing us. In terms of presenting yourself as uniquely on social media, I would honestly say that every voice is unique. And as long as you're presenting yourself and being genuine, you will be unique on social media.
Nice answers. Emily, do you have any other last words before we go to a conclusion? Because we're just about out of time.
Nope, I think what Ed said, just be your authentic self and you'll be awesome.
Any go backs for anyone else? Yes, magic fingers. Anything else in terms of other thoughts that any of our presenters would like to share?
Well, if you're not already on social media, I look forward to seeing you there.
All right. I have a request, and that is I'd like you to, all of our participants, to think about whether this session met your goals and whether there was something particularly useful or interesting in this session. For those who are here physically, if you wouldn't mind jotting them down on Post-its, that would be great. For those of you who joined us virtually, if you wouldn't mind entering them in the chat box, that would be wonderful. If you do not want to enter a comment in the chat box because you want it to be anonymous, I can also create a survey. I will create an online survey. But if you enter things in the chat box, you can do that now more quickly. So that's my thought. But I will create an online survey that you can also use to present things, and I will email that out to everyone. I do want to thank you all. Please join me in thanking our presenters for donating their time and energy. We really, really, really appreciate it.